Ayana had always been a quiet girl, her curiosity often drawing her eyes to the edges of the forest that bordered her village. Unlike other children, she did not fear the shadows beneath the trees or the rustling of leaves. She felt a strange kinship with the whispering woods, sensing their life and wisdom even as she played at the village's edge. Her gentle nature and keen mind, however, were a source of envy within her family. Her stepmother resented the attention Ayana received for her intelligence, and even her siblings grew jealous of her insight, seeing it as a threat to their standing in the village. What they could not comprehend they sought to punish. One morning, under the guise of a lesson in obedience, they led Ayana toward the forest's edge with cold, forced smiles. The trees swayed as if observing the moment, their branches whispering softly in the wind. Before Ayana could fully understand their intent, her stepmother shoved her into a hidden path, far from the familiar village roads, and left her there, claiming she would learn humility and respect. Ayana stumbled, her small feet sinking into the moss-covered earth, as the shadows of towering trunks enveloped her. Panic rose in her chest, yet she refused to succumb entirely to fear. She had always been resilient, and now her survival depended on it. The forest greeted her with a strange, almost sentient calm. The wind brushed against her cheeks like the softest caress, carrying scents of pine, wet earth, and distant flowers. The rustling leaves seemed to murmur secrets, as if the trees themselves acknowledged her plight. Ayana felt a shiver of awe and fear, realizing that this was no ordinary woodland. Each step she took was watched by countless eyes hidden in the bark and branches, and though the shadows stretched long and dark, she did not feel entirely alone. She wandered cautiously, listening to the forest's subtle language, the snapping of twigs, the gentle sway of leaves, the murmur of water in a nearby stream. Even as the night approached and the temperature dropped, she found that the forest offered signs of protection. Hollow logs became temporary shelters, and soft moss cushioned her resting spots. Though hunger and cold gnawed at her, Ayana felt the first stirrings of a bond she could not yet name, a recognition that the forest remembered her presence and would in some way respond to her suffering. As she settled beneath an ancient oak, the moonlight filtering through the canopy, Ayana whispered her fear and sorrow to the trees, unsure if they could hear her. The wind picked up, rustling the branches in a way that felt like a reply, a comforting rhythm in the darkness. She realized that her pain had not gone unnoticed. Somewhere deep in the forest, hidden among roots and leaves, the trees had taken note of her abandonment. Though she was alone in body, she was not alone in spirit, and that realization gave her the first spark of hope, that even in a place where humans had betrayed her, the world itself might yet stand beside her. As the night deepened, Ayana began to notice a subtle rhythm in the forest, a quiet murmur that seemed to flow through the leaves and branches like a hidden language. She paused beside a moss-covered stone, listening intently, and heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper carried by the wind. At first she thought it was her imagination, a trick of loneliness and fear, but the pattern persisted. The trees were speaking, or at least responding to her presence, acknowledging her pain, and guiding her steps in ways she could not yet understand. The whispers came in patterns. A rustle to the left meant a safe path, a sway to the right indicated a hidden obstacle. Ayana's heart lifted with each subtle gesture, realizing that the forest itself was aware of her plight. She felt as if the trees remembered every injustice done to the innocent and that somehow, through their ancient memory, they had recognized the cruelty of her family. The wind seemed to echo her thoughts, carrying her fears and sadness in a way that felt like conversation, though she could not yet speak her gratitude aloud. She moved cautiously, following the guidance of the whispering leaves. Tiny lights flickered between branches, fireflies, she realized, or perhaps spirits of the forest, dancing in quiet celebration of her resilience. The forest seemed to shield her from predators. She caught glimpses of animals darting through the undergrowth, watching her passage with curious, intelligent eyes. Every footstep she took was cushioned by the soft carpet of moss, and every branch that bent to the ground seemed to offer her support, a bridge over uneven terrain, a guard against unseen danger. By the time she reached a small clearing near a trickling stream, Ayana began to understand the forest's intentions. It was not merely a backdrop to her survival, it was a living, breathing ally. The trees leaned toward her, their branches forming a gentle canopy, as if enclosing her in a protective embrace. The wind carried soft murmurs that seemed to echo her own voice, forming words she could almost comprehend: reassurance, guidance, and the promise that she was not abandoned entirely. The forest, ancient and patient, had marked her as worthy of attention, and its memory of pain, the injustices inflicted upon innocents, was awakening in response to her suffering. Ayana sat by the stream, dipping her hands into the cool water, feeling a strange communion with the forest. She spoke aloud to the trees, her voice trembling at first but growing steadier with each word. She told them of her family's cruelty, of the fear that had gripped her heart, and of the loneliness she had carried since being left in their care. The leaves rustled in reply, a gentle rhythmic murmur that comforted her and instilled a new determination. Though she had no voice to defend herself in the village, and no allies to protect her from human cruelty, the forest's whispers assured her that she was not powerless. For the first time since being abandoned, Ayana felt a spark of hope. She realized that while humans could betray, nature remembered, and the forest's memory could act in her defense. The night stretched on, moonlight filtering through the branches, and Ayana, once trembling with fear, now felt the first stirrings of courage. She understood that her survival was no longer a matter of escape alone, but of connection, with the wind, the trees, and the ancient consciousness that watched over the forest. And in that understanding she sensed that the path ahead, though fraught with danger, held the promise of protection, guidance, and perhaps one day justice. The first night alone in the forest was unlike anything Ayana had ever experienced. Darkness enveloped her, thick and absolute, broken only by the pale light of the moon filtering through the dense canopy above. Her stomach growled, her body shivering from the cold, and every rustle of leaves or snapping twig sent her heart leaping. Yet even in her fear she noticed something extraordinary. The forest seemed to be alive in ways she had never truly understood. Shadows moved with purpose, leaves rustled with intent, and the wind carried a presence that both comforted and guided her. Ayana stumbled through the undergrowth, her small hands brushing against moss-covered stones and the rough bark of ancient trees. Though she was alone, she did not feel entirely abandoned. Tiny animals, nocturnal and curious, observed her passage without fear. Owls hooted softly, their eyes reflecting the moonlight like mirrors, and fireflies drifted past her like tiny lanterns, illuminating the dark paths. Even the trees seemed to shift, their roots forming gentle arches that allowed her to pass safely, or their branches bending down to shield her from unseen dangers. The forest, it seemed, had claimed her as its own, recognizing her courage and her suffering. By the stream that wound through the clearing, Ayana found her first shelter, a hollowed log, softened by moss and leaves, offering warmth and protection. She crawled inside, curling her body to conserve heat, and listened. The rustling of the leaves above became a lullaby, the wind a gentle whisper of reassurance. She realized that the forest was more than a place. It was a living entity, responsive and aware, capable of remembering the pain inflicted upon her and acting subtly to ensure her safety. Her fear did not vanish, but it became tempered by a growing sense of awe and connection. As she settled into the hollow log, Ayana reflected on the injustice that had brought her here. Her family had abandoned her out of jealousy, their cruelty leaving scars that the wind now carried softly through the branches. She understood, with a clarity born of suffering, that she could no longer rely on human kindness alone. The forest, patient and enduring, offered guidance and protection in ways her family never could. She whispered her thoughts into the night, speaking of her fear, her loneliness, and her determination to survive. The wind, as if carrying her words to the trees themselves, responded with a rustle, a murmur, a subtle movement of branches that promised she was not forgotten. Throughout the night, Ayana experienced both terror and revelation. She faced hunger and cold, the ever-present threat of predators, and the haunting isolation that came with being alone in such a vast, indifferent wilderness. Yet she also discovered the first stirrings of hope and resilience. The forest had begun to teach her patience, awareness, and trust in forces beyond her understanding. By dawn, she felt a quiet strength rising within her, a connection to the living world that pulsed around her and whispered that she was not powerless, that her suffering was remembered, and that the forest, in its own mysterious way, would stand by her side. Ayana moved cautiously through the dense undergrowth, her bare feet sinking into soft moss and fallen leaves. Each step carried the weight of fear, but also a growing sense of determination. She had survived the first night, guided subtly by the whispers of the wind and the shifting branches of trees that seemed to bend protectively around her. She had begun to sense that the forest was more than a collection of trees and shadows. It was alive, watching, remembering, and responding to the injustice that had been done to her. With every step, she listened to the subtle murmurs among the leaves, feeling as though the very earth beneath her feet was speaking to her, urging her to keep moving forward, to survive. The forest became her teacher. From the smallest fern to the tallest oak, each element offered lessons in resilience, patience, and subtle power. Ayana learned how to read the rustling of leaves as warnings, to sense danger from the faintest disturbance in the wind, and to find safe paths where predators or traps might lurk. Birds became her silent allies, warning of approaching humans or marking the locations of edible fruits and clean water. Even the nocturnal creatures, the raccoons, foxes, and owls, seemed to recognize her presence and offered guidance in small, almost imperceptible ways. It was as though the forest had claimed her as one of its own, teaching her the ancient knowledge of survival and subtle influence. Days turned into nights and nights into days, yet Ayana's spirit did not waver. The isolation was profound, but she discovered a new kind of strength, an understanding that she was part of something greater, a network of life that responded to her presence and her intentions. The forest did not merely shield her from danger, it communicated with her. Reflections in pools of water, the shimmer of dew on leaves, even the arrangement of fallen branches seemed to convey messages, sometimes in cryptic patterns, sometimes in clear guidance. Slowly, she began to understand that the trees and the wind remembered all the pain inflicted upon innocence and that they could act, subtly yet decisively, when injustice approached. In her wanderings, Ayana encountered small pockets of human life, hunters passing through, a group of villagers gathering berries, but she remained in hiding, observing rather than interacting. She learned that not all humans were cruel. Some were compassionate, even if they lacked the courage to oppose wrongdoing openly. These observations strengthened her understanding of the world. Kindness, courage, and wisdom were not always recognized immediately, yet they held immense power when combined with patience and careful observation. She realized that she could not confront her family recklessly. Doing so without preparation would expose her to danger. The forest's guidance was not just protection, it was a teacher of strategy, subtlety, and resilience. By the end of the first week, Ayana had developed a rhythm with the forest. She spoke softly to the trees, confiding her fears and her anger, and the wind carried her words through the branches, almost as if sharing her story with the very soul of the forest. In turn, the trees whispered back. Patterns of leaves would sway to indicate safe paths, streams would bubble in gentle encouragement, and animals would appear to lead her away from harm. Ayana began to understand that the forest was not merely alive, it was conscious, its memory vast, and its will aligned with justice. Her abandonment had been cruel, but the forest had heard, and it was responding. Each step she took was guided by the knowledge that she was not alone, that her pain had been recognized, and that, when the time came, the forest would rise in her defense. By the second week, Ayana's fear had transformed into cautious confidence. She no longer saw herself as a helpless girl cast out into the woods, but as a participant in a living world that had begun to teach her its ways. She learned humility, patience, and observation, discovering that survival was as much about understanding and respect as it was about strength. The forest whispered its lessons through every breeze, every rustle, and every shifting shadow, shaping Ayana into someone who could endure, who could resist, and who could, when the moment came, command the quiet yet unyielding power of the woods that had chosen to remember her pain. As Ayana continued her journey through the forest, she began to notice patterns in the way the trees and wind responded to her presence. The forest was alive with memory, each leaf and branch seemingly attuned to the echoes of human cruelty and compassion. She realized that the forest did not merely protect her out of chance, it remembered her pain. It had witnessed her abandonment, and now it was shaping her survival, offering guidance and subtle lessons in the art of living within its living corridors. Ayana's heart swelled with a mixture of awe and humility. Here was a world older and wiser than any she had known, a world that could teach her patience, resilience, and respect in ways her village never could. The days passed with quiet rigor. Ayana learned to move silently, avoiding the attention of predators and wandering humans alike. She discovered edible roots and berries, learned which streams offered the purest water, and began to recognize the signs of impending storms or danger. But survival alone was not enough. The forest demanded something of her in return. She began to speak softly to the trees, confiding her fears, her anger, and her sorrow. At first, her words felt like murmurs swallowed by the dense woods, but gradually she sensed responses. A branch would bend as she approached, guiding her steps. Leaves would rustle in patterns that seemed deliberate, almost communicative. Even the wind, carrying the faintest scent of pine and damp earth, seemed to echo her emotions, whispering reassurance and encouragement. Through this communion, Ayana discovered that the forest's memory was deep and precise. It recalled every injustice inflicted on innocents, every harsh word spoken in cruelty, and every act of kindness overlooked by humans. She began to understand that the forest's protective gestures were not arbitrary, they were deliberate acts of justice in miniature. When hunters ventured too close, thorns and twisted roots would block their path. When wandering villagers threatened to stumble into harm, branches would shift, creating subtle barriers, nudging them back toward safety. Ayana realized that her presence in the forest was not hidden. It was recognized, acknowledged, and honored. With each passing day, Ayana's bond with the forest grew stronger. She began to move with confidence, no longer trembling with every rustle in the leaves. She learned to read the signs of animal behavior, the subtle shifts of light on moss, and the whispers of wind as guidance. The forest, in turn, seemed to respond with increasing attentiveness, bending and stretching in ways that protected her and facilitated her exploration. She discovered small clearings where the sun warmed the earth, hollowed logs that made comfortable shelters, and streams whose water refreshed and healed. The forest had become both her teacher and her companion, offering the wisdom of centuries in every subtle gesture. Even in the stillness of the night, Ayana felt the forest's presence as a guardian. The rustling leaves and swaying branches seemed alive with intent, each sound a reminder that she was never truly alone. The pain inflicted upon her by her family had awakened a consciousness in the woods, and now it guided her, nurtured her, and quietly trained her in the ways of survival and strategy. She began to see the forest as an extension of herself, a living reflection of her own growing strength, patience, and wisdom. By the end of her first month, Ayana had become attuned to the forest in a way that transcended fear. She no longer saw it as merely trees and shadows but as a sentient, responsive being that remembered the injustices of the world and acted on behalf of those wronged. The forest had become her mentor, her protector, and her ally. In the gentle sway of branches, the murmur of leaves, and the whispering of the wind, Ayana had found a source of guidance and strength that would prepare her for the challenges yet to come. The trees had begun to teach her not just survival but understanding, strategy, and, ultimately, the art of justice. Ayana had begun to understand that survival was only the first lesson the forest intended to teach her. One morning, as the mist clung to the ground like a veil and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, she ventured toward a part of the woods she had not explored. The trees here were older, their trunks twisted and gnarled, their roots forming intricate networks beneath the forest floor. She paused, feeling the weight of their presence, the almost tangible awareness that she was standing in a sacred space. The air vibrated softly with whispers, carrying the memories of countless innocents who had wandered these woods, seeking refuge or solace. It was here that she met the oracle of the forest, not a person but a presence manifested in the interplay of light, shadow, and sound. A hollow tree trunk shimmered faintly with a golden light, and from it came a voice, soft yet resonant, as if the forest itself had learned to speak. "Ayana," it said, "your voice has been stolen, yet the wind carries your words. Your pain is remembered, and your courage has awakened the forest's memory. But the forest alone cannot act without your understanding." Ayana knelt, her heart pounding with awe. She listened as the forest revealed that it had long observed the injustices of the world and had chosen her because her spirit was pure, patient, and resilient. The oracle, or the consciousness of the forest speaking through the tree, taught Ayana how to channel her emotions and her intent. The wind, it explained, was a carrier of words, a medium through which the silenced could communicate. Leaves could shift to signal warnings, roots could trap the cruel, and branches could form barriers against those who sought harm. But these powers required more than desire. They required understanding, discipline, and the cultivation of empathy. The forest would defend her, but she had to learn patience, courage, and cleverness if she wished to use this alliance wisely. Ayana spent days in the presence of the oracle, learning to listen and observe with meticulous attention. She practiced moving silently through the undergrowth, reading the subtle shifts in light and shadow that indicated danger or opportunity. She learned to interpret the murmurs of the wind as messages, to sense the intentions of those who approached the forest, and to communicate without words through gestures and intent. Every interaction with the trees, the soil, the streams, and the animals became a lesson in strategy, humility, and resilience. The forest also taught her the importance of discernment. Not every human was cruel, nor was every forest creature an ally. Understanding who and what to trust was crucial. Ayana learned that her power was not in loud defiance or brute force, but in subtlety, patience, and the ability to act with wisdom when the moment demanded it. The oracle emphasized that justice could be achieved not through anger alone, but through foresight, prudence, and moral clarity. The forest's memory was long, and its protection would respond to genuine virtue, but only if she understood and respected its ways. By the end of this period of tutelage, Ayana felt transformed. She had gained not only knowledge of survival, but the understanding of how her connection with the forest could become a force for justice. She could feel the tree's awareness flowing through her, the wind carrying her intent across the forest, and the earth itself seeming to hold her presence in memory. Though she was still hidden from the world of humans, she no longer felt powerless or alone. She had become part of something far greater, a living network of awareness that could respond to cruelty and remember the wronged. She had learned that patience, courage, and cleverness were her weapons, and that the forest would act alongside her when the time came to confront those who had abandoned her. Ayana moved silently under the thick canopy of the forest, her senses heightened by weeks of observation and guidance from the trees. Every rustle, every whisper of wind, and every shifting shadow had become a language she could read. The forest had taught her patience and subtlety, and now she understood that brute force or impulsive action could endanger her. She needed a plan, a careful approach, and the forest had been her teacher in the art of strategy. Her stepfamily, she realized, had underestimated not only her courage but the unseen forces that now moved with her. Under the cover of dusk, she approached the boundary of the village, careful to remain unseen. The familiar sight of her home stirred a mixture of longing and bitterness in her chest. Her stepmother's house rose proudly above the rest, its windows glowing with light, oblivious to the presence of the girl who had been cruelly cast aside. Ayana watched as her siblings played near the courtyard, unaware of the silent shadow observing them. She recognized the opportunity to learn about their routines, their weaknesses, and the cracks in the household's facade. This knowledge would be essential when the moment came to reclaim what was hers. As she ventured closer to the palace-like structure her stepmother had assumed control of, Ayana noticed subtle signs of human arrogance and complacency. Guards laughed carelessly, servants whispered idle gossip, and the stepmother herself moved with a false confidence that betrayed insecurity beneath the surface. Each movement and careless word became a piece of a puzzle Ayana was slowly assembling. She realized that while the forest provided protection, her success depended on understanding the human element, how fear, envy, and pride could be used as both weapon and shield. Finally, she reached the edge of the grand mirror chamber, a place of whispered tales and hidden power. The magical mirror, long a silent witness to the palace's intrigue, shimmered faintly as she approached, as if recognizing the return of the wronged. Ayana stepped closer, her reflection obscured by shadows, and felt the mirror's subtle pulse, a rhythmic glow that seemed to respond to her heartbeat. She could feel its awareness acknowledging her courage, her patience, and the quiet strength that had sustained her through weeks of isolation and training. The mirror, it seemed, was not merely an object but a sentient participant, waiting for the moment when truth and virtue would be ready to claim their place. Her stepmother, sensing an unusual presence, appeared suddenly in the chamber, her eyes narrowing. She had grown accustomed to her supposed superiority, believing that no one could challenge her claim. "Who dares enter here?" she demanded, her voice sharp with authority and fear beneath the surface. Ayana, careful to remain hidden in the shadows, understood that confrontation in this moment could be dangerous. She could not risk being discovered before she had gathered enough knowledge and allies. The stepmother's anger revealed cracks in her composure, and Ayana noted every detail, the hesitation in her voice, the slight tremor in her hands, the way she underestimated the unseen. Ayana retreated silently, leaving the chamber with the knowledge she had gained and the sense that the mirror itself was beginning to stir. Its faint glow followed her as she disappeared into the forest, a promise and a warning intertwined. She understood that this was only the first encounter, a subtle test of patience and strategy. Force alone would not reclaim her identity or her rightful place. Instead, she would need allies, careful planning, and the continued guidance of the forest. The night air embraced her as she moved, carrying whispers of reassurance through the branches and leaves. The wind seemed to murmur, the moment would come, but only when she was ready, and only when her courage, wisdom, and patience had been fully honed. Ayana's days in the forest had taught her patience, observation, and subtlety, but she knew that alone she could not reclaim her stolen identity. She needed allies, those who understood truth and virtue, and who could act when the moment demanded courage. Returning near the village under the cloak of twilight, she began to notice patterns among the people she had observed from afar. Servants who had witnessed her stepmother's cruelty but feared reprisal, guards who showed glimpses of hesitation in their loyalty, and nobles whose allegiance was swayed by kindness rather than tyranny. Each person became a potential thread in the web of support Ayana would weave. Moving carefully, she approached the first of her new allies, a young servant girl named Luma, who had quietly tended to Ayana in the past, leaving food outside her hiding place without ever speaking of it. Luma's eyes widened with awe and relief when Ayana revealed herself, but the girl's loyalty had already been proven. She shared the knowledge of the household's routines, the stepmother's quirks, and the places where guards were inattentive. Ayana listened intently, absorbing every detail, understanding that patience and trust were more potent than bold action at this stage. Over the following nights, Ayana sought out others, gradually assembling a quiet network of support. A retired guard, loyal and secret, offered subtle guidance on movement through the palace corridors. A sympathetic cook provided information about when the stepmother would be distracted or vulnerable. Even minor nobles, previously silenced by fear, confided in her, recognizing the justice of her cause and the danger of unchecked cruelty. Ayana realized that leadership was not merely claiming power, it was inspiring it quietly in those around her, building loyalty through example, integrity, and courage. Meanwhile, the magical mirror continued to communicate in subtle ways. Its surface shimmered faintly whenever Ayana approached, revealing glimpses of the stepmother's corruption in fleeting reflections. It seemed to encourage patience, hinting at weaknesses to exploit and patterns to follow. Ayana understood that the mirror was not just a tool for confrontation. It was a teacher, shaping her understanding of justice and morality. Through these reflections, she learned to recognize that the true measure of leadership lay not in beauty or loud authority, but in kindness, cleverness, and the ability to inspire trust. Ayana's network expanded slowly, and she began practicing the subtle strategies the forest had taught her, now combined with human intelligence. She moved unseen, delivering messages, observing the palace, and learning the vulnerabilities of her stepmother's reign. Every small success, an ally convinced, a guard distracted, a plan executed without notice, built confidence and demonstrated the power of collective action. The forest's whispers seemed to follow her, rustling leaves in encouragement, bending branches in recognition of her careful progress. She felt the pulse of life in every tree, every blade of grass, and every gust of wind, all silently supporting the just cause she represented. Through these actions, Ayana also began to cultivate her own inner strength. The fear and isolation that had once defined her time in the forest transformed into resilience and clarity. She learned to trust her instincts, to read subtle cues in both nature and human behavior, and to move decisively when the time was right. Her kindness and humility drew people to her, even as her stepmother's cruelty isolated her from allies. Ayana realized that leadership was not about dominance or intimidation. It was about wisdom, compassion, and the courage to act rightly, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. By the end of this period of preparation, Ayana had transformed from a frightened, abandoned girl into a figure of quiet power. She understood the delicate balance of strategy, alliance, and patience, and she knew that when the moment came to confront her stepmother, it would be with the full weight of moral clarity, human allies, and the forest's subtle guidance behind her. She was no longer alone. She was part of a network that combined intelligence, courage, and the memory of the living forest, all aligned toward justice and the reclamation of what had been stolen. Ayana's time in the forest and her careful network of allies had prepared her for what the magical mirror called the test of truth. One quiet evening, she approached the palace once more, her presence masked by shadows and the whispers of the wind. The mirror awaited her, gleaming faintly in the chamber where her stepmother's reflection often gleamed with false pride. The air was thick with anticipation, charged with a power she could almost feel pulsing through the walls. This was more than a confrontation. It was a trial, a challenge set not by humans, but by the mirror itself, a judge of virtue and courage. The first illusion arose as she entered the chamber. The mirror shimmered, casting images of her deepest fears. Herself, abandoned and powerless, wandering endlessly in the forest, never reclaiming her face or her rightful place. Ayana steadied her breath, remembering the lessons of patience and observation taught by the forest. She realized the mirror's illusions were meant to test her spirit, to see whether she would act out of fear or remain steadfast in truth. She closed her eyes briefly, centering herself, and when she reopened them, the illusions dissolved. Her calm resolve dispelled the false images, showing the mirror that her courage was genuine and her heart unwavering. The second test was of wisdom. The mirror conjured scenarios that forced her to choose between immediate revenge and long-term justice. The stepmother appeared in these visions, triumphant and mocking, yet each choice Ayana faced required discernment, patience, and careful consideration of the consequences. Impulsiveness would have doomed her, but Ayana's weeks of learning to read the forest and understand human behavior had sharpened her judgment. She chose actions that reflected strategic thinking and compassion, proving that her strength lay not only in courage but in wisdom, and that she could wield influence responsibly. The final trial challenged her moral integrity. The mirror created illusions of people she loved being harmed by her inaction, tempting her to compromise her principles for immediate satisfaction. The wind whispered around her, carrying the voices of the forest, reminding her that true power lay in patience and virtue. Ayana held firm, refusing to succumb to the temptation of rash action, demonstrating that her heart remained pure despite the injustices she had endured. She realized that the mirror sought not just a face or a title, but a spirit capable of guiding others with fairness, compassion, and strength. As she completed the trials, the palace began to sense subtle changes. Courtiers whispered of strange happenings, the mirror's surface glimmering with unusual light, reflections that seemed to show truths long hidden, and an unseen presence moving through the halls. Even her stepmother, unaware of the mirror's judgments, began to feel unease. She attempted to manipulate what she thought she understood, but the illusions exposed her corruption, her malice, and the emptiness behind her assumed authority. The palace's order, founded on deception and fear, trembled as the test of truth revealed its fragility. Through the trials, Ayana learned an essential lesson. Her true identity and spirit could not be stolen, no matter the mask imposed upon her. Beauty and authority were transient. Virtue, courage, and wisdom were permanent. The mirror had not only tested her but also affirmed her intrinsic worth. The forest had guided her steps, her allies had reinforced her resolve, and now the mirror confirmed what all her actions had proven, that she was and had always been the rightful and true heir to her legacy. Her stolen face was only a temporary barrier, one that could not erase the essence of who she was. The moment had arrived. Ayana stood before the magical mirror, her heart steady, her mind sharpened by the forest's lessons, and her allies quietly waiting in positions carefully arranged throughout the palace. The mirror's surface shimmered like liquid silver, reflecting not only her image but the very air around it, vibrating with a power older than the palace itself. Ayana could feel its sentience, its awareness recognizing her courage, wisdom, and resilience. She took a deep breath, the wind outside carrying her whispered thoughts, and stepped closer. This was the culmination of all she had learned, all she had endured, and all she had become. As she approached, the mirror began to glow, faintly at first, then with increasing intensity. The air seemed to hum with the resonance of ancient magic. Ayana's reflection shimmered, and for the first time in weeks she saw her true face, not the mask that had been stolen from her, not the stepmother's false mimicry, but the radiant essence of who she truly was. Her eyes glimmered with quiet power, her features soft yet commanding, and her expression held the calm strength of someone who had survived trials no one else could imagine. The mirror pulsed in response, as if acknowledging her rightful place and the purity of her spirit. Suddenly, the surface of the mirror rippled, and the stepmother's image appeared beside Ayana's, distorted and flickering. Her eyes were wide with shock, her lips parting in a silent scream as the mirror revealed her greed, her cruelty, and the countless deceptions she had spun to claim what was not hers. The court, assembled in the chamber, gasped, their attention drawn to the mirror's unveiling. Courtiers who had once bowed to the stepmother's authority now stared in disbelief as the truth emerged in vivid clarity. The mirror, ancient and unyielding, displayed the essence of virtue and vice side by side, leaving no room for denial. Ayana's heart remained steady. She did not speak in anger, she did not shout accusations. Instead, she let the mirror's power speak for itself. Each truth revealed by the mirror resonated through the chamber, echoing the lessons she had learned in the forest. Patience, courage, wisdom, and moral integrity surpass outward appearances and stolen beauty. The mirror shimmered further, casting light across the room that seemed to touch each observer, awakening their own conscience, forcing them to reckon with the deception they had allowed to stand unchallenged. The stepmother's face, once adorned with Ayana's stolen beauty, began to dissolve like mist in the sunlight. Her arrogance crumbled visibly, replaced by panic and despair. She reached toward the mirror as though she could stop its judgment, but the magical reflection remained unmoved. The mirror did not act out of vengeance, nor did it favor loud claims or vain displays of power. It acted according to the principles it had always upheld, principles that recognized the true essence of leadership and the moral weight of courage and integrity. Ayana's allies, who had observed silently, now stepped forward, offering support and protection if needed. Yet it was clear that the true victory belonged to her spirit, her strength, and the lessons she had absorbed in the forest. The mirror's glow intensified, enveloping her in a warm radiance that seemed to seep into the very walls of the palace. Courtiers whispered in awe, noting that Ayana's demeanor radiated authority, not through intimidation or beauty, but through the quiet, undeniable power of virtue. It was as though the mirror had drawn the invisible contours of her soul for all to witness. At last, the mirror's glow centered fully on Ayana, and the chamber fell into a profound silence. Every observer understood. The rightful queen stood before them, not merely because of a stolen face returned, but because her character, courage and wisdom had passed every test, every trial, and every subtle judgment of the magical mirror. The stepmother, her deception fully revealed, was left exposed and powerless. No mask, no lie, and no cruelty could withstand the combined force of truth and integrity. Ayana stepped closer to the mirror, feeling its warmth, and quietly acknowledged the lessons that had brought her here. The forest had taught her patience, strategy, and the strength of moral resolve. Her allies had provided guidance, knowledge, and support. And the mirror had tested her, revealing the essence of her soul and confirming that her courage, wisdom, and purity of heart were undeniable. The stepmother, stripped of false power, could no longer claim what was not hers. The rightful order had been restored, not through violence, but through the demonstration of virtue, the quiet power of patience, and the undeniable clarity of truth. As the mirror's glow faded to a steady luminescence, Ayana's face shone fully and naturally, radiant in its authenticity. She stepped back, allowing the court to absorb the lesson, that leadership is granted by virtue, integrity, and courage, not by theft, fear, or appearance. The chamber seemed transformed, imbued with the echoes of a story that would be remembered for generations. Ayana's rightful place was affirmed, and the mirror, satisfied, reflected her true self with a gentle, unwavering light. The stepmother's fall was both immediate and profound. The court, once enchanted by her stolen beauty and false authority, now saw her for what she truly was, cruel, vain, and unworthy of the power she had seized. Her attempts to justify her actions were hollow, and whispers of fear and shame rippled through the chamber. Ayana, standing tall and composed before the mirror, did not raise her voice or strike with anger. Instead, she approached her stepmother with calm authority, letting the truth and the mirror's judgment speak for themselves. Her presence alone conveyed that justice had been restored, and that cruelty and deception would no longer command respect. The stepmother trembled, tears streaming down her face, realizing that her schemes had not only failed but had exposed her to the full weight of the court's scrutiny. She fell to her knees, pleading, her voice choked with desperation, and Ayana saw a moment of humanity flicker amidst the ruin of her vanity. In that instant, Ayana made a choice that would define her reign before it even began. She extended mercy. Placing a gentle hand upon her stepmother's shoulder, she said, "Your fear and envy blinded you, but you need not fall entirely. Learn from this and choose kindness instead of cruelty." The gesture was small, yet it carried the immense power of compassion, a force stronger than anger or revenge. The courtiers and villagers, who had gathered to witness the events, were struck by the contrast between the two women. Ayana's quiet strength, her dignity, and her wisdom shone brighter than any stolen beauty ever could. Murmurs of admiration and relief spread through the crowd. People realized that the restoration of justice did not require vengeance. It required moral courage, integrity, and the ability to forgive when the opportunity arose. The stepmother, humbled and chastened, could no longer command authority through fear. Instead, she was offered a path to redemption, guided by the example of Ayana's mercy. From that day forward, the palace changed. Mirrors, once feared as instruments of judgment, became symbols of clarity, honesty, and justice. Courtiers learned that their actions, no matter how small, were subject to moral reflection, and that virtue would always be recognized, whether by magic or by the quiet observations of a just ruler. Ayana's example inspired those around her to act with integrity, to honor the weak and the voiceless, and to understand that true power lay in wisdom and compassion rather than vanity or cruelty. Ayana herself embraced her new role with a blend of humility and quiet authority. She sought to govern not through fear but through guidance, listening to the needs of her people and acting with fairness in all matters. The lessons she had learned in the forest, through the trials of patience, strategy, and moral discernment, became the foundation of her reign. Her mercy toward her stepmother became a tale whispered in the corridors of the palace, teaching that forgiveness could transform even the darkest heart, and that justice tempered by compassion was the truest form of strength. Through these actions, Ayana cemented her place as a leader worthy of the crown, not because of beauty, magic, or stolen authority, but because she embodied the qualities that the mirror, the forest, and the people had always sought: courage, wisdom, and a heart guided by truth and integrity. Years passed, and the story of Ayana, the girl whose courage, wisdom, and kindness had restored justice, became legend throughout the land. In villages and towns, parents recounted her tale to children, not as a simple story of magic or revenge, but as a lesson in character and integrity. They spoke of the forest that had taught her patience, the wind that had carried her silenced words, and the mirror that had revealed the essence of virtue. Children grew up learning that true leadership and honor were not measured by outward appearances, but by courage, compassion, and moral strength. In the palace, Ayana's reign was marked by fairness, diligence, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Courtiers and citizens alike came to understand that the mirror, once a silent observer, now symbolized the eternal truth that virtue and wisdom guided the rightful ruler. Ayana consulted the mirror not out of vanity, but as a reminder that honesty and clarity were essential for governance. She encouraged dialogue, listened to grievances, and rewarded acts of courage and kindness. Her reputation spread far beyond the borders of her kingdom, reaching neighboring lands where stories of her integrity inspired other rulers to consider virtue above greed or vanity. Every year, during the Festival of Reflection, the palace opened its doors to the public. Mirrors throughout the grand halls gleamed with a mystical light, reflecting not only the faces of those who gazed into them, but also offering glimpses of their intentions and character. Citizens learned to approach these mirrors with respect, understanding that the palace now stood as a place where truth was honored and falsehood could not flourish. Those who had once been cruel or deceitful found themselves humbled by the awareness that their actions were visible in the quiet observation of both magic and morality. The magical mirror itself continued to guard the palace, its surface shimmering faintly as it always had, yet now it shone with the reflection of a ruler who had earned her place through courage, wisdom, and mercy. It became a symbol of the enduring power of integrity, reminding all who saw it that no mask, no theft, no cruelty could ever override the strength of a true heart. Ayana's story was told not just for its drama, but as a guide to living rightly, to value honesty, to act with compassion, and to honor the silenced, the gentle, and the wise. Even as generations passed and new rulers came and went, the legend of Ayana endured. Children recited her story by hearth and lantern, scholars inscribed her deeds in books, and storytellers wove her journey into songs that drifted through the forests and across the rivers. The lesson was clear: the rightful queen was not chosen for beauty or dominance, but for the heart that guided her actions, the courage to face trials, and the wisdom to act with mercy and fairness. Ayana's reign became the gold standard of leadership, a beacon of hope and moral clarity for all who sought justice. Her legacy proved that virtue could never be stolen, that integrity outshines deception, and that a true heart, guided by courage and compassion, could change the course of history. The tale concluded not in vengeance or sorrow, but in triumph. A reminder that the world remembers those who act rightly, and that true leadership is always chosen by the heart, not the mask.